0347 local time. The Strait of Hormuz. A U.S. Navy E-2D Hawkeye holds an orbit 30 nautical miles east of Bandar Abbas, its rotodome painting the entire choke point in a single sweep. Below it, two Arleigh Burke destroyers, Mason and Bulkeley, slide into a slow north-south line, weapons tight, radars wide. A third surface combatant repositions south of Lerwick Island. Within 40 minutes, every commercial tanker queued at the eastern approach has been told to hold position. Outbound traffic from Ras Tanura is rerouted. Insurance underwriters in London are notified before sunrise in the Gulf. By the time the first Reuters headline lands, the world reads a single phrase: the United States Navy has closed the Strait of Hormuz. That is the visible event. That is the headline. And the headline is misleading. Because the United States Navy did not close the Strait of Hormuz to punish Iran. It closed the Strait of Hormuz to deny Iran the one card Tehran has spent 40 years preparing to play. What looks like an act of aggression is, in operational terms, the preemptive removal of a weapon from an opponent's hand before the opponent can lift it. And the moment that weapon is taken away, every assumption underpinning Iranian deterrence collapses with it. The public reading is simple. Washington has cut off 20% of the world's seaborne oil. Brent crude spikes. Asian buyers panic. European chancelleries scramble. The narrative writes itself: American overreach, global economic shock, and administration gambling with the world economy. That is the story being filed in capitals from Brussels to Tokyo within the first 6 hours. But underneath that story, a second one is unfolding, and it has almost nothing to do with oil prices. The closure is not about commerce. It is about sequencing. About denying Iran the ability to choose the moment of escalation. Because for decades, the closure of Hormuz has been Iran's threat, not America's. The leverage was always supposed to flow in one direction. And on this morning, that direction has been reversed. So the question that matters is not why the United States did this. The question is what Iran was about to do, and what Washington saw coming that made a preemptive closure the lesser risk. Look at the geometry first. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest is 21 nautical miles wide, with two 2-mile-wide shipping lanes separated by a 2-mile buffer. The northern coast belongs to Iran. The southern coast belongs to Oman's Muzandam exclave. Every tanker transiting the strait passes within range of Iranian coastal artillery, Nor and Ghadar anti-ship cruise missiles, IRGC Navy fast-attack craft swarms operating out of Bandar Abbas, Bandar Lenja, Keshem, Abu Musa, and the Tons, and a layered network of bottom-influence mines that can be seeded by dhows, submarines, or modified merchant hulls in under 72 hours. Against that, the United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, fields a forward-deployed posture built around a carrier strike group when one is on station, a permanent destroyer presence of typically 4 to 6 Aegis-equipped surface combatants, patrol coastal squadrons rotating out of Bahrain, a mine countermeasures detachment of Avenger-class vessels and helicopter-borne MH-53E sweepers, and the air wings operating from Al-Udeid, Al-Dafra, and the carrier deck itself. The Bataan or Wasp-class amphibious ready group, when present, adds a marine expeditionary unit and a vertical assault capability. P-8 Poseidons fly continuous maritime patrol from Bahrain and Diego Garcia. Submarines, Virginia-class, occasionally Ohio-class guided missile boats, sit silent under the Gulf of Oman. That is the visible architecture. On paper, it is overwhelming. In practice, it has always carried a single structural weakness, and Iranian planners have spent 30 years building doctrine around it. The weakness is cost exchange. An Iranian Nor anti-ship missile costs perhaps $200,000. An SM-2 interceptor costs over $2 million. A Standard Missile-6 costs more than $4 million. A single Arleigh Burke carries 96 vertical launch cells, and not all of them are loaded with anti-air interceptors. Many are tasked with land attack tomahawks, anti-submarine rockets, and ballistic missile defense rounds. The math, when stretched across a saturation attack involving dozens of low-cost cruise missiles, hundreds of fast attack craft, and swarms of one-way attack drones, becomes uncomfortable very quickly. The Houthi campaign in the Red Sea demonstrated this in miniature. Aegis worked. It always works. But the magazine empties faster than the threat does. And the magazine is not the only finite resource. Mine countermeasures assets in the region number in the low double digits. Sweeping a contaminated strait is not a matter of hours. It is a matter of weeks. During those weeks, no insurance market in the world will underwrite a transit, regardless of what the Navy declares about freedom of navigation. The economic effect of a mined Hormuz outlasts the military operation by months. This is what Iranian planners count on. Not victory. Endurance. The theory has always been that Iran does not need to defeat the United States Navy. It needs to make the cost of keeping Hormuz open higher than the political cost of letting it close. Asymmetry. Saturation. Time. And that theory has now been broken by the simplest move possible. The United States closed the strait first. Consider what that does to the Iranian playbook. The mine threat is neutralized because there is no commercial traffic to threaten. The cruise missile threat is degraded because the targets, laden tankers, slow, predictable, civilian crude, are not in the water. The swarm doctrine, premised on overwhelming Western rules of engagement against civilian-adjacent targets, collapses because the rules of engagement have already shifted. Every contact in the strait is now military. Every contact is now a legitimate target. Iran no longer gets to choose the ambiguity that has historically protected its forces. And there is the hidden variable. Speak to anyone who has worked the Gulf maritime problem at the analytical level, and they will tell you the same thing. The decisive American advantage in Hormuz has never been the carrier. It has been the submarines. A Virginia-class boat operating in the Gulf of Oman, or a Los Angeles-class refit, forward deployed through Diego Garcia, sits inside the Iranian targeting cycle in a way that surface vessels cannot. Iran's anti-submarine capability is, by any honest assessment, marginal. 3 Kilo-class diesel boats based at Bandar Abbas, a fleet of Ghatar midget submarines suited to coastal denial rather than open ocean engagement, and a handful of ASW-capable helicopters. Against a modern American attack submarine, that force structure provides detection, not interdiction. A naval officer who worked Fifth Fleet operations during an earlier escalation cycle described it this way: the surface fleet is the message. The submarine force is the meaning. When you see destroyers, you are being told what Washington wants you to see. When you do not see the submarines, you are being told what Washington wants you to fear. And on this morning, the destroyers are visible. Which means the submarines are not. That is the layer underneath the closure. The United States has not simply blockaded a waterway. It has established a kill box. Any IRGC Navy fast attack craft that sorties from Bandar Abbas now transits water that is being held by an attack submarine it cannot find, under air cover from a carrier wing it cannot suppress, watched by an E-2D it cannot reach, and tracked by AP-8 it cannot shoot down. The asymmetry has been inverted. The cost exchange now runs in the other direction. This is where the equation changes. For 40 years, the threat of closing Hormuz has been Iran's strategic insurance policy. It underwrote the nuclear program. It deterred Israeli strikes on enrichment facilities. It complicated every American calculation about regional escalation. The threat did not need to be executed to function. It only needed to be credible. Tehran's leverage came from the implication that any sufficiently aggressive Western action would trigger an oil shock response so severe that the political cost would freeze the operation before it began. That implication is now gone. Because once Washington has closed the strait itself, the threat of Iran closing it ceases to mean anything. You cannot threaten to do what has already been done. And you cannot extract concessions by promising an outcome the other side has already accepted. That was the visible layer. The hidden layer was always the timing. Because closures are not permanent. The United States cannot indefinitely keep 20% of global seaborne crude offline without strategic consequences of its own. Alliance pressure from East Asia, particularly Japan and South Korea, both of whom draw heavily from Gulf suppliers, political pressure from European partners, price pressure that feeds into domestic inflation cycles. The closure has a clock on it. Estimates inside the analytical community suggest a sustainable window of perhaps 10 to 14 days before the diplomatic cost begins to exceed the operational benefit. Possibly less, depending on strategic petroleum reserve releases and coordinated draws from IEA members. Within that window, Washington has to extract a strategic outcome. Otherwise the closure becomes a demonstration without a conclusion, costly, theatrical, and, in the long run, corrosive to deterrence. So what is the outcome being sought? This is where the analysis sharpens. A senior intelligence officer who has briefed on Iranian escalation pathways once framed it this way. There are only three things Tehran cannot afford to lose: the nuclear program, the IRGC's regional proxy network, and the regime's monopoly on the narrative of resistance. Anything else, economic pain, diplomatic isolation, even tactical military losses, can be absorbed. Those three cannot. A closure of Hormuz by American forces does not directly threaten any of the three. But it threatens the assumption underneath all of them. It demonstrates, in real time and on global television, that the regime's central deterrent, the threat to the world's oil supply, is a card the United States can take off the table at a moment of its own choosing. Every proxy commander in Beirut, Sana'a, and Baghdad is watching. Every nuclear scientist in Natanz and Fordow is watching. Every Revolutionary Guard officer is watching. And what they are watching is the public dismantling of the strategic logic that has protected them for a generation. That is the real target of the operation. Not oil. Not ships. The credibility of Iranian deterrence itself. And the response options available to Tehran are narrower than they appear. Consider them in sequence. Direct attack on U.S. naval forces in the Strait invites a calibrated American response against IRGC Navy infrastructure, Bandar Abbas, the island bases, the missile coastal batteries, that Iran cannot easily replace and that, once destroyed, takes years to reconstitute. Activation of proxy forces against U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria is available, but the proxy networks have been bled by Israeli operations across the past 18 months, and the political license to strike back hard in the Levant now extends further than it once did. Ballistic missile strikes against Gulf state targets, Saudi Aramco facilities, UAE infrastructure, invite Arab realignment that Tehran has worked carefully to avoid, and may bring assets like THAAD batteries and Saudi air defenses into direct engagement, exposing capability gaps Iran would prefer to keep hidden. There is the asymmetric option: cyber, terrorism abroad, mining of unrelated waterways like Bab el-Mandeb through Houthi proxies. These remain available. But they are slow. They do not address the central problem, which is that the strait is closed right now, and the longer it stays closed under American control, the more the deterrent value of Iranian threat posture decays. And there is the option of doing nothing, of waiting out the closure, allowing the Americans to absorb the diplomatic cost and reopen the strait on their own timeline. This is, in some ways, the most dangerous option for Tehran, because it confirms the lesson Washington is trying to teach. That Iranian threats can be preempted at acceptable cost. That the red line was never as red as it was painted. A carrier strike group commander who has operated extensively in the Fifth Fleet area of responsibility framed the dilemma cleanly. Iran's problem is not capability. Iran's problem is that every response either escalates into a war it cannot win, or de-escalates into a precedent it cannot survive. That is the trap. And that is what the closure was designed to construct. Look at the timing. Look at the broader picture. The closure does not happen in a vacuum. It happens against a backdrop of accelerating Iranian enrichment activity, of degraded proxy networks, of fractured economic conditions inside Iran, and of a regional alignment in which the Abraham Accord states, Saudi Arabia, and Israel are quietly coordinating in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The strategic environment around Iran has been narrowing for years. The closure of Hormuz is the moment that narrowing becomes visible. There is a further layer worth naming. The closure changes the calculation around the nuclear program itself. For years, the assumption inside Western analytical circles has been that any military action against Iranian enrichment sites would trigger a closure response, that the price of striking Natanz or Fordow would be measured in tankers and oil markets. That linkage has now been severed. If the United States can close the strait on its own terms, then closing the strait can no longer function as Iran's nuclear insurance. The doorway to other options has been pushed open, and not just for Washington. For Israel as well. This is the hidden geometry. The closure is not a single operation. It is the first move in a sequence whose later moves are now permitted by the success of the first. And that changes everything downstream. Consider what an EW specialist working the Gulf problem set would point out about the second-order effects. The closure forces Iran to activate its coastal defense radars, its missile fire control systems, its command and control nodes, all of them now emitting, all of them now being catalogued by American and Allied collection assets. RC-135 rivet joints out of Al-Udeid, EP-3s and their successors. The Hawkeye orbits. The submarines listening on the bottom. Every Iranian response, whether kinetic or merely demonstrative, feeds the American electronic order of battle. The intelligence harvest from a single week of this posture exceeds what peacetime collection accumulates in a year. That harvest is not for today. It is for the strike package that may or may not be assembled later. For the targeting folders that get built and refined and held in readiness. For the next escalation cycle, in which the United States and its partners will know, with precision, which Iranian batteries to neutralize first, which command nodes to sever, which radars to blind. The closure is also a reconnaissance operation conducted at the scale of an entire choke point. So when the headlines speak of American aggression and global economic shock, they are describing the surface of an operation whose strategic content runs 3 or 4 layers deeper. The closure removes Iran's central deterrent card. It establishes a kill box that inverts the cost exchange. It traps Tehran between escalation options that all lead to outcomes worse than the closure itself. It generates an intelligence harvest that conditions every future operation in the theater. And it demonstrates, to every actor watching, that the strategic logic Iran has relied on for 40 years can be dismantled in a single morning. What people see is the closing of a waterway. What is actually happening is the closing of an era. The visible layer is the strait. The hidden layer is the deterrent. And the deterrent, once broken, does not reset when the ships move and the tankers resume their transits. The lesson stays. The precedent stays. The knowledge that this can be done, that it has been done, stays inside every calculation made in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Jerusalem, in Beijing for years to come. There is a saying among naval planners that the most decisive battles in maritime history were the ones that were not fought. The fleet that arrived in the right place at the right time, demonstrating what was possible, and reshaping the assumptions of every actor watching, without ever firing a shot in anger. The closure of Hormuz may belong to that category. Or it may not. The next 10 days will decide. But what matters now is not the headline. It is what the headline is hiding. For 40 years, the question has been what Iran would do if the world tried to take away its leverage in Hormuz. This morning, that question has been answered in a way no one expected. The world did not wait to find out. It moved first. And the answer Iran now has to give is not a tactical answer. It is a strategic one. It will define what the regime is, and what the region becomes, for the decade ahead. That is the equation. That is the trap. That is the morning the strait was closed not by Iran's hand, but against it. And somewhere east of Bandar Abbas, at the edge of a Hawkeye's radar horizon, in water no surface vessel can map, the submarines are listening. They have been listening for a long time. They will be listening for as long as the closure holds. And what they hear will shape what comes next. If this analysis sharpened the picture for you, consider subscribing for more long-form strategic breakdowns of the operations that move beneath the headlines. The visible story is rarely the whole story. The next one is already unfolding.